What's up, everyone? Hey, it's Mr. Jones. I'm coming at you this time with a video that I'm attempting to try and answer the question, why are people so divided along political and cultural and religious lines, right? Like, why are good people divided? That is the question that I want to ask, and a question that I want to propose something that I've been thinking about, but also I learned a lot from a book that I've mentioned before. This one, I'm just going to plug it again, The Righteous Mind. Notice that the subtitle of the book is actually the question I'm trying to answer. And this book does a really good job of doing that. And what I'm presenting to you today is in a good chunk part from this book. So I recommend this one, The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. This book was written in 2012, but it applies even more to today with all of the crazy division we're seeing. And I want to kind of talk about what is exactly going on here. Is there any way we can explain this crazy division, right? This us versus them, this kind of stuff. And in order to start off, we have to go take a step back. We have to look at people from a little bit of an evolutionary lens. So humans are tribal by nature. Okay, we want to fit in, we want to belong to a group. And that makes sense, right? If you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense considering the fact that if you are not part of a group, if you are an outcast from a group, that was extremely bad news, right? Because by being isolated, you don't have access to all of the benefits that come with being part of a social group, right? Things like more access to resources, more protection from the elements. You have more access to relationships like friendships, romantic relationships, access to mating partners. These kinds of things were extremely important. And so it makes sense that humans have this innate desire to feel like they are part of a group, right? To want to belong to a tribe or a group, right? So this is sort of the basis of where I'm going to start from. And by the way, this is a completely reasonable thing to want to do. This desire to be part of a group is absolutely reasonable. There's nothing wrong with it. It just turns out that there are some things that are associated with it that we need to be careful about. So in order to be part of a group, you have to sort of adopt the norms of that group, right? The social norms, the cultural norms, to feel like you fit in, right? If you don't adopt any of the norms and the rules and all the things that go along with that group, you'll be outside, you'll be ostracized, you'll be outcasted. So you have to adhere to the group norms to be part of the group. We can think of many examples, right? For like even in the most mundane examples, like to be part of a group of people that like sports, right? A certain sports team fan group. You've got to adopt the norms. You got to cheer for the team. You got to love the players on the team. You have to like have certain rituals, right? There's like chants and like all these different things that go along with being part of that group. And so in order to feel like you will belong in that group and to be accepted, you have to adopt those norms, right? And then that scales up from something, maybe really meaningless like a sports team, although some people take that to extremes.
We're the best football team in the land. Yes, we are!
We're dominating this search and destroy.
We love free bases! We love free bases!
But scale that up, to something like a religion or other ideologies that people adopt the values and beliefs of that system to be part of the group. And I want you just to take a moment of reflection to think about, is there any time in your life where you have adopted a belief or even said things or thought things that in reflecting upon them, you realize that they were just something you were doing to feel like part of a group? I think we've all done this. It's completely natural. I think back to the times when I was younger, in middle school and elementary school and even in high school, things that I would do and say that allowed me to feel more connected to the group, even if it was something that I don't necessarily think I believed at a deep core level. I still would do things to feel like I fit in, because no one wants to be a social outcast. That's the worst thing in the world, to be a social outcast. And so we will do things and say things that potentially go against logic, go against reason, and even potentially can go against our values and beliefs that we have from other parts of our life. The thing to consider here is that this is such an important part of human nature to feel part of a group. The vast majority of humans will hold being part of a group. They will value the inclusion in the group higher than even things like objective truth or reason. If believing the truth gets you ostracized from a group, most people are not willing to do that because the costs are too high. Believing in the truth in and of itself is not enough to counterbalance the downsides of being cast out from a group. And you will probably notice that the people in the world that are the most truth-seeking people, that sort of disregard cultural or ideological norms and tend to be sort of off on their own, they tend to be more isolated, right? Because they are thinking in a way that's not aligned perfectly with the norm. But it's pretty rare to find those kinds of people, and they don't typically have the best, happiest lives because their social life suffers because they are not ingratiating themselves into a cultural or a group norm situation. Instead, they value truth above fitting into a group. Okay, so we've got this idea of like quote unquote tribalism, this idea of people wanting to belong to groups and being willing to believe and adopt beliefs that put them into those groups and make them accepted. So that's one component. The other component I want to quickly talk about is this idea of intuition versus reason. Most people, when they make decisions, they attempt to make decisions from a logical or rational perspective. Now, we all know that we don't always do that. We can make decisions based off of emotion that we may regret later.
It's an interception! Why? Why?
Biggest deal. How dare it?
But for the most part, people seem to strive to make decisions that is logical, right? Free from emotion. In the book here, Jonathan Haidt is sort of making an argument that, in fact, every decision is ultimately based off of some sort of emotion or intuition, and that even the ones that we think are being completely rational and logical are in fact coming from a place of emotion. It's just we don't see it. He uses an analogy of a rider and an elephant. So he wants you to imagine a giant elephant with a rider perched atop the elephant. The analogy is that the rider is like our logic, our reason, right? And the elephant is our emotion or intuition. Really, like, who's in control? The elephant is really in control. The rider might think he has some control, but ultimately, if the elephant wants to move one way or the other, the rider is kind of at the will of the elephant in that regard. And so the analogy that he makes there is to kind of think like your emotions are what's really driving you. It's just sometimes we don't feel like they are because we think we're being rational. But deep down, if you were to dig deep down, you might find that there's some sort of deep-seated intuition or emotion that exists there, right? And that you're using logic and reason to justify that emotion or that intuition, even if it doesn't feel like it. So this gets into something called post-hoc rationalization, which is this idea that humans are really good at using our specially designed brains that are really good at logic and reason to go back and justify something that we have an emotional intuition about using that really good mechanism of logic and reason. So a good example would be like of post hoc rationalization might be something like, I don't feel like exercising today, so I will now justify that feeling with some logic and reason by saying, well, it's hot outside, or I worked out 2 days ago, or I got to do this other thing. I can use logic and reason to backtrack a little bit and like fill in some justification for ultimately what is satisfying just an underlying emotional desire, right? Just a feeling of not wanting to do something, right? So we all do that, right? Sometimes obviously, and sometimes we know we're doing it. But Jonathan Haidt argues that, in fact, we're doing it all the time, even with things that we don't think we are. Even when we think we're being at the height, right, of logic and reason.
These are facts, and facts don't care about your feelings.
Ultimately, we're just post hoc rationalizing some seed of intuition that we have at the bottom of it.
These are feelings, and feelings don't care about your facts.
Now, okay, the question would be, how would you ever know? And that's the tricky part. You might not ever know that you're doing it, but just being aware of the fact that it's possible that even the most reasonable, logical, calm chain of thought, right, can sometimes be guided by an underlying emotion or intuition. And so just being aware of that fact might help you spot it occasionally. So I gave the exercise example, right, of a kind of a silly example of post hoc rationalization. There are so many examples you can give, right? Think about all the conspiracy theories that exist out there. So I have an intuition that the earth is flat, or I feel like it's flat. Now I can go back and justify that by finding all this evidence and putting it in, and I'm creating a logical and reasonable explanation to justify that the earth is flat.
How can it hold trillions of tons of water upside down? Oil tankers can sit there and they're 1,000 million tons in weight, and yet a moth can just fly off the bow of that boat. I'm quite happy on a flat plane and a geocentric model with something like this that's just heavier than air, so it drops. It's due to its density. And if something is lighter, like a hot air balloon, it'll rise. That's buoyancy. I'm quite happy with that because that makes total sense on a flat plane.
But that ultimately, that earth is flat was an intuition or a feeling I had. Or maybe it's some sort of a belief in regards to a political opinion, or a belief in terms of a religious belief.
We make no apology about the fact that we believe the earth is only thousands of years old. And on day 6, he made Adam. And then we learn, as we read in the genealogies there, like in Genesis 5, we learn that Adam had a son, Seth, at 130, and then Seth fathered Enos at 105, and Enos fathered Kenan at 90, and Kenan fathered, I don't know how to pronounce it, at 70, and then he fathered Jared at 65, and Jared fathered Enoch at 162, So that's where we get the age of the earth from.
All of these things, we're really, really good at doing this. Humans are amazing at post hoc rationalization. It's a skill that we have that we put to good use to justify ourselves and to make ourselves feel like we're doing something that's logical and reasonable, even if it's based off of some sort of emotional kernel of intuition.
By your logic, I could claim that this rock keeps tigers away.
Oh, how does it work?
It doesn't work.
Uh-huh.
It's just a stupid rock.
Uh-huh.
But I don't see any tigers around here, do you?
Lisa, I want to buy your rock.
So humans are tribal by nature. We want to fit in. We're willing to adopt beliefs in order to fit into a group. 2, we're really good at what's called post hoc rationalization, which means going back and using logic and reason to fill in and justify our emotional intuition that we might have, right? Some belief, some value. Now the question is, if all humans do this, what are the things that humans tend to post hoc rationalize? To look at this from a moral lens, a perspective of morality. Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist and a researcher, has done a lot of research on the kinds of foundational moralities that people tend to base their beliefs and opinions on. He outlines these sort of 6 moral foundations. Number 1 is something called care/harm, is this idea that it is right or moral to care for people and to protect people from harm, unnecessary harm. That's one. The second one is the second moral foundation that he describes is called fairness/cheating. The idea that we have this emotional moral intuition that it is wrong to cheat others and that we want to strive for fairness. Moral foundation number 3 is this idea of loyalty/betrayal. We have a moral intuition that it's better to be loyal to the group, not betray or lie or go behind people's back. It's better to be loyal to a group. Number 4, moral foundation is something called authority/subversion. This is the moral intuition that we should respect some sort of authority. There's a moral intuition that we should abide to some sort of structure that has authority. It doesn't necessarily mean a person, but it could be a structure, a set of rules. We should be abiding by those rather than sort of disregarding those and subverting the authority. Moral foundation number 5 is something called sanctity/degradation. This is the moral intuition of sort of like purity a little bit, like trying to keep yourself clean, quote unquote. And it doesn't necessarily mean physically clean. It can, right? Like our like being disgusted by unhygienic conditions is one thing that we do base some morality off of. But also just sort of like clean in a sense of like void of anything that we might consider impure. And that's a very broad thing. So it could mean different things for different people. But it does seem to be that all humans do have this idea of sanctity/purity, that we want to keep things clean and avoid things like disease from a physical perspective, or things that might make us unclean or impure. And then finally, the sixth moral foundation is something called liberty/oppression. And this is a moral intuition that we want to be free from oppression. We don't feel like we should be forced into anything that's particularly oppressive. We should have the liberty or the freedom as an individual to do the things and seek out the things that make us happy. So these six moral foundations are what Haidt argues pretty universal, right? You go anywhere, he's done studies all over the world and looked at different cultures and different nationalities, and he's found that these six foundations exist everywhere. Now, the difference between different cultures is the emphasis that people put on those six foundations. It is not true that everyone values those six foundations equally. And this is where some of the issues can arise, because certain groups and certain cultures, right, value some of these foundations higher than others. Now, why might you value certain foundations higher than others? Turns out a lot of it is actually genetic. People have certain predispositions to value certain ones of these foundations. And it's obviously a little environmental too, because if you're raised in a culture that values some of these, you adopt those beliefs as well to be part of the group. We all have sort of natural inclinations as to which ones we particularly value from a genetic perspective and from an environmental perspective. So the example that Jonathan Haidt gives in the book that he uses is politics. So he studied and did some research and gathered some data by using surveys and questions to identify what kinds of moral foundations people tended to value more. And he looked at people that were conservative, identified as a kind of conservative, right-leaning, maybe more on the Republican side, versus liberals, more on the left side, more democratic. And what he found is that it looks like conservatives tend to value all six moral foundations relatively equally. They use all six of them to inform their beliefs and their actions. Whereas the liberal self-identifiers tended to value two of the six much higher than the other four. Those two were the care and harm moral foundation and the liberty/oppression foundation. So what that means is that liberals tended to really, really value treating people fairly in terms of not harming people unnecessarily and making sure people were free from being oppressed. So it tends to be that liberals are much more empathetic towards individuals who are being harmed or being oppressed in some way. And liberals tend to put less emphasis on those other four moral foundations. So things like sanctity/purity and the authority foundation are much less important for people that identify as liberal. Whereas if you're conservative, you put more value into respect for authority. The idea of sanctity and purity are higher as far as a value, a moral foundation, and that's reflected in their beliefs and their actions. And so a lot of times what we see is when we have political conflict between conservatives and liberals, a lot of times what they end up arguing about oftentimes are differences in their weighting of their moral values. Just to clarify, I'm not saying any of these are right or wrong. All I'm doing is trying to present this idea that there are these six moral foundations, it seems, right, based off of the research that we have here, that there are these six moral foundations that people tend to emphasize in different ways based off of a little bit of their genetic predisposition and a little bit of the culture and the group they were raised in. Right? And so you can imagine that you're going to have people around the world that tend to emphasize different foundations. And then obviously when you scale that up to how they act in the world and what the things they believe in the world, you will notice that there's going to be some differences and some conflict, right? And so the important thing to keep in mind here is that if there's some sort of conflict over something, some ideological conflict over some topic, Haidt would argue that if you really dig down, they're actually the reason why they're on opposing sides is because they are valuing different moral foundations. One group values one moral foundation, whereas another group values a different one. Okay, so let's combine some things now. Combine this idea of tribalism, this idea of intuition versus reason and post-hoc rationalization, and this moral foundation idea. And we can now start to put together an idea of why people become so divided. People want to be part of a group. right? So they will group up with people that tend to have the same moral foundations or value the same moral foundations as them. Then they all use their ability to post hoc rationalize their beliefs by filling in with logic to support their underlying intuition of which moral foundation they value, right? And then that scales up a little bit to having potentially divided groups over topics because the groups are arguing at each other, trying to use logic, right? Say like, no, this is right. No, this is right. This is right. No, this is right. But what they're really arguing about is, if you dig down, is the valuing of the different moral foundations at the bottom. And so what you see in like political discourse and in arguments between different groups and ideologies and beliefs is they're arguing about something at a higher level, whereas in reality, what they're really arguing about is something deeper, that moral foundation that they might differ in terms of their weighting of it and how important they think it is. And so what we see, in discourse, public discourse, and sometimes even private discourse, is people, in camps, in groups, arguing for their group versus another group, right? You have minor things like sports team A versus sports team B. Go sports team A. No, go sports team B. Then you have maybe like, oh, I'm an Apple guy. No, I'm an Android guy, right? I'm PC, I'm Mac. Those are sort of more trivial, but you can keep going up and then you get into things that have a little more importance in the real world context. Things like conspiracy theorist groups. I believe in flat Earth. Flat Earth doesn't exist. Climate skeptics versus people that believe in climate change. Anti-vaxxers versus people that believe vaccinations are useful. All the way up to things like Democrats versus Republicans. And then you can even get into religions, which are huge, big ideologies, right? Islam versus Christianity versus Hinduism versus, whatever else, right? All of these different beliefs. Now, why has it seemed to get worse and worse? At least in my life, that's the way it's felt. And I've been looking into this a lot, and I do think that the internet has been a huge catalyst for this division. And I want to give a couple reasons for this. One, the internet allows people to communicate more effectively with each other so that information is passed faster, quicker, instantaneously, right? It gives people platforms to talk to each other. But but there's some negative things associated with the internet that's allowed people to kind of group themselves and find other people that they can sort of group together with and feel part of a community more easily. And so it creates what are called echo chambers. You've heard this term before, right? You have these echo chambers that exist where all of the people in this group sort of reinforce each other's beliefs and values, and they're all sort of egging each other on. And so it makes their views more and more extreme as they sort of reinforce each other. It's like a positive feedback loop a little bit, where you get into a group and you start saying something that you get validation from, which makes you more confident about your idea, which makes you be more outspoken about it, which validates you more within that group. And before you know it, you can move to a more extreme view because you've gotten that kind of group validation.
You'd be surprised to know just how much can be done with sound. This is how an echo is produced. It's a curious lopsided room where neither the walls nor even the ceiling and floor run parallel. That's just to stop favoritism for certain sounds.
The other problem is that the way that a lot of social media sites are designed are based off of algorithms that tend to push things to you that often you would be interested in seeing that are like other things you've seen, which again creates a little bit of an echo chamber where, like, you're on YouTube, you're watching videos, let's say you're watching videos about conservative things, they recommend more conservative things, so you see more, and eventually all you're seeing recommended to you are things about like conservative viewpoints or flat earther viewpoints or anti-vaxxer viewpoints, or you're getting reinforced via the algorithm, which pushes you further into that belief.
So there you are, you're about to hit play on a YouTube video, and you hit play, and then you think you're gonna watch this one video, and then you wake up 2 hours later and say, oh my God, what just happened? And the answer is because you had a supercomputer pointed at your brain. And at the moment you hit play, it wakes up an avatar voodoo doll-like version of you inside of a Google server. And that avatar, based on all the clicks and likes and everything you've ever made, they can simulate more and more possibilities. If I prick you with this video, if I prick you with this video, how long would you stay? And the business model is simply what maximizes watch time. This leads to the kind of algorithmic extremism that you've pointed out. And this is what's caused 70% of YouTube's traffic now to be driven by recommendations, not by human choice, but by the machines.
So the way I see it, and the way I think a lot of people see it, is that the internet has basically exaggerated and amplified humans' natural tendencies to be tribal and to want to fit in. So what happens is you get these groups that form where people reinforce each other over and over and over again, and all you ever see are people commenting that are in agreement with you, videos that agree with you, and all these things that just reinforce your ideology or your viewpoint, right? And you just use them as post hoc rationalization to validate your underlying emotional intuition based off of whatever moral foundations you value. And you spend a bunch of time there, and you don't see any other perspectives or any other viewpoints. And then when you do, because it's so rare and because you've been so validated in your viewpoint, when you see a dissenting viewpoint or a differing opinion, you can attack it because you're like, well, that has to be wrong because all I know is this, and this has to be right. So it can be really, really troublesome. And I think that that's a huge reason why we're seeing an increase in division and an increase in group identity and all of this craziness that's going on right now.
And it turns out that outrage, moral outrage, gets the most engagement. So it was found in a study that for every word of moral outrage that you add to a tweet, it increases your retweet rate by 17%. So in other words, the polarization of our society is actually part of the business model. Another example of this is that shorter, briefer things work better in an attention economy than long, complex, nuanced ideas that take a long time to talk about. And so that's why you get 140 characters dominating our social discourse. But reality and the most important topics to us are increasingly complex, while we can say increasingly simple things about them. That automatically creates polarization because you can't say something simple about something complicated and have everybody agree with you. People will, by definition, misinterpret and hate you for it. And then it's never been easier to retweet that and generate a mob that will come after you. And this has created a call-out culture and chilling effects and a whole bunch of other subsequent effects in polarization that are amplified by the fact that these platforms are rewarded to give you the most sensational stuff.
Okay. So all of that, I think, just to conclude, like, what are the takeaways? I wanted to lay out an argument for like why I think we can see this increased division between groups. Group A versus Group B in any arena is getting worse and worse and worse and causing a lot of division in our society. And I think, like I mentioned, it's due at rock bottom to people having different moral foundations, which they then post hoc rationalize using what they believe is honest logic and reason to justify their position. They find other people that have the same, and because we want to be part of a group, we reinforce each other, we adopt the group norms and the group beliefs, and we feel part of a group to satisfy our psychological need for that groupness. The internet has come along, which has made this even worse with echo chambers, right? And the algorithms that exist on things like Facebook, YouTube, Google, Twitter, whatever, that show you only things that reinforce your beliefs. And it's erupting when these groups now come into contact with each other. Right? And there's not as much discourse, rational discourse between them, because people don't realize that what they're really arguing about are moral foundations, not the specific topic that they're arguing about, right? They don't dig deep enough to figure out what it is that they really are arguing for and really understand where another person is coming from. So to conclude, we are all susceptible to this. Everyone is susceptible to this. There's nothing you can do about it, right? You are a human. You exist in a society. You're going to want to belong to a group, and I think it's healthy to want to belong to a group. So I'm not saying just abandon all groups and go just live in the forest by yourself. That's not the solution. The solution is to just be aware of how susceptible you are to falling into groupthink, into an echo chamber, into believing something that you really think is logical and rational, when in actuality, you're just using your high ability to reason and logic, but you're really just justifying, post hoc rationalizing your underlying sort of moral foundation. So I would just say, be wary, always kind of check, think about it, expose yourself to different viewpoints. Don't feel like you only have to reinforce the things you believe in. Look at the opposite side of the argument. Really look at it. Don't look at it just to make fun of it or just to dismiss it, because realize that there's people that believe that. And why do they believe it? You have to figure that out so that you can identify more with them and understand where they're coming from. So don't lock yourself into one way of thinking. Really open up your viewpoint to try and understand as many viewpoints as possible, and really critique and dig down in your own beliefs and values to see if they make sense. But in the back of your mind, always realize that you have a predisposition to want to justify things that you feel, even if you don't think you're doing it. This doesn't mean you should abandon all of your principles and core values, right? But you should just understand where they are coming from. And so when you have an emotional reaction or an intuition on something and you feel something about a certain topic, I want you to take a second to stop and try and think about whether or not you are justifying something in a post hoc rationalizing way. And if you are, that might be okay, because eventually at bottom, we all have our own moral foundations that we have to go with, right? That's just a fact of the way humans are. So ultimately, don't abandon your principles or core values. Just perform some routine maintenance on them. Every once in a while, check your beliefs, check your thoughts, and think, where are they coming from? And try to avoid drinking the Kool-Aid, i.e., don't get yourself locked into an echo chamber where all you're hearing is the same exact thing over and over again. I know it was a long video, there's a lot there, but I think it's really important if everyone was able to analyze and sort of really pick apart their beliefs and understand them, where they're coming from, and try and do the same to others. I think it would change a lot of the discourse we're seeing. It would decrease the division. People would be able to be more empathetic to each other, understand where each other is coming from, and ultimately realize that we all have the same moral foundations. It's just that we might be choosing to emphasize different ones at different times, and we can have a civil conversation about whether or not we think this moral foundation is valid to emphasize in this particular case or not. And then we can go from there. But the problem is when people don't get to that level, they start arguing about a higher level idea without really understanding where each other is coming from, and having a conversation about something that's well past what the core conversation should be. I appreciate everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, whatever, let me know. Other than that, I will see you when I see you. Peace. Stay safe.